Now, reactions continue to trail the Nigerian Coast Guard bill at the Senate that has scaled its second reading. Sponsored by Senator Wasiu Eshilokun, APC Lagos, the bill sought to establish the Nigerian Coast Guard to be charged with the responsibility of securing maritime zones within Nigeria. Vice Admiral Ezeoba and Mfon Usoro spoke on this issue just last week here on The Morning Show. Now, with their appearance on the program, they insisted that the bill is a duplication of the responsibilities of the Nigerian Navy, saddled with coastal protection of the country's waterways.
A to I of the bill, which clearly enunciates the responsibilities and duties of the Coast Guard as it would be if established. A clear duplication of the functions of the Nigerian Navy as we speak today under their policing functions. As clearly stated in Armed Forces Cap 20, which is an amplification of 217, Section 217 of the Nigerian Constitution, which in its wisdom created the armed forces and did elucidate what their responsibilities will be. So in the circumstance as it is today, it is completely out of reality and out of sync to think that the Coast Guard, with the same responsibilities and functions of the Nigerian Navy as extant as it is today, will solve the problem.
Section 1 of the bill is very clear that they seek to establish a Coast Guard as a military service and a branch of the armed forces of Nigeria. How is a branch of the armed forces established in our country? Is it a person, an individual? Can it be through a private member's bill? What is the process? Because I think that that bill shouldn't even have been on the floor of the National Assembly, even from first reading, let alone second, and then going on. Because it accentuates the lack of coordinated, cohesive policy-making process.
Well, joining us now for a right of reply is Olisa Agbakoba, former president of the Nigerian Bar Association. Good morning, sir, and welcome to the program.
Morning. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Agbakoba, you had Vice Admiral Ezeoba retired, yeah, and Mrs. Mfon Usoro. Now, they have expressed their concerns. What was not covered in that video is that they even believe that the Coast Guard bill, if we have a national Coast Guard, will create chaos, anarchy, confusion, and that the same way that bill had been rejected in the past, it should be rejected again this time. It's gone past second reading. There was supposed to be a public hearing on Friday, but that was postponed to cover the 7-day mourning period of General Taoreed Lagbaja. Yeah. But now the matter is still on the table and it's still coming back for public hearing. What's your reaction? Do you agree with Mrs. Usoro and Admiral Ezeoba?
Well, thanks very much, Ruben. I would not necessarily make...
Hello? Please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Go ahead, okay.
Clearly.
I say I would not necessarily... yeah, sure. I'll not necessarily make my response as if it were a reply, because I'm not quarreling with anybody. I'll just say what I think. So my first point is that the issue of a Coast Guard is an extremely old one in Nigeria. I've been in the industry for the last 44 years, and I have personally pushed for a Coast Guard to patrol our maritime waters. We need that sort of protection. Maritime security is such a vital aspect of any country that says it's a coastal nation. Nigeria is a coastal nation. But what has happened is that we've had a series of ad hoc arrangements going back to the National Maritime Coordinating Committee in the 80s, and then to the Presidential Task Force on Security. And the present arrangement, which NIMASA is pushing, is that NIMASA, in collaboration with the Navy, provides maritime security for our maritime waters in the context particularly of the issues around crude oil theft. But my view is that a Coast Guard is an institutional requirement in the maritime sector. It's a very important point. It's an institutional requirement in the maritime sector. The Coast Guard needs to be a freestanding organization. It stands on its own. Its core function is law enforcement of the maritime waters. Problem with the Navy is that they are a fighting force. Coast Guards are not a fighting force, even though I must admit that there's a lot of naval presence in the constitution of a Coast Guard. I've looked at least 6 different countries: South Africa, the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia. All of them. Just to point out what happens in the US Coast Guard service was under the control of the Department of Transportation until 9/11, when it was transferred to the Department of Homeland Security, not the Navy, not the Defense. The Coast Guard service in the UK is under is an executive agency of the Department of Transportation. And this is very reasonable because the Coast Guard is essentially a law enforcement agency. It's not a fighting force. The Navy is a fighting force. But what then happens would be, for instance, the President of America or the Defense Secretary has required during war transfer the Coast Guard for military service. But essentially what the Coast Guard does is protect our maritime waters, it protects our aquatic, it protects our natural resources around Nigeria, inland waterways, and at the borders. And in this way, it brings into Nigeria a lot of revenue. The Navy's role as a Coast Guard service is absolutely peculiar to the issues of the Niger Delta. That's why they came in. So you have the platform provided by the Navy and the funding from NIMASA. But that's not what we want. We want to have a Coast Guard service that is predicated on the requirements of the International Maritime Organization, that says the core mandate of any Coast Guard must be something that stands alone. The Navy has such different functions. I don't see how it is best suited to perform the functions of the Coast Guard that is proposed. Yes, I concede that the Coast Guard would have, a role to play. That is why when you compose the Coast Guard service, the Navy has a role to play. But it's essentially a civilian law enforcement agency. Its core function is the implementation of maritime regulations, and there are a number of them listed by the International Maritime Organization. So I would absolutely push for a Coast Guard. There's no question that the Coast Guard with a core mandate of maritime security is required. I don't think there's a debate. There can be a debate around structure. Who will be part of it? Will the Navy play a role? Will NIMASA play a role? But the Coast Guard needs to be established.
Structures
it's
and
far
roles.
Too long in Nigeria we've not had the Coast Guard, and the problem has been
Dr. Agbakoba,
that we've lost a lot of revenue. Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic. All right, as we're talking about functionality, apologies about that. Okay, I see you've been able to put it back in. All right, so as we're talking about functionality, the different roles and so forth, one of the points of contention in the conversation we had last week was around the fact that there hasn't been a comprehensive analysis that can truly differentiate the roles, the different roles that would be played by the Coast Guard and the Navy. So one of the arguments here is that, yes, as much as they're saying that the Coast Guard is supposed to be its own independent structure, they feel that there hasn't been sufficient analysis, threat analysis done in terms of gathering empirical evidence to justify it. What's your take on that position?
Well, that would be a very ill-informed view. Anyone who understands what the Coast Guard is, I mean, even here, I have at least 10 examples of Coast Guard services around the world. A Coast Guard service, let me be very clear, is a civilian law enforcement agency that implements maritime regulations. A naval force is a fighting force. It is not a civilian force. Completely different services. There's no doubt that in certain circumstances, a naval force might be required to assist the Coast Guard. Why is it that in the United States of America, where they have a Coast Guard, it is under civilian control? And there is a provision that the Coast Guard may be deployed for military services if the Defense Secretary makes such a prescription. Exactly the same provisions apply in the United Kingdom, where the Coast Guard is an executive agency of the Department of Transportation, with the possibility of being transferred, if required, to military duties. So essentially, the Coast Guard is like a military police in the waters. That's all. That's all it is. So you have the Merchant Shipping Act setting out diverse stipulations for what the Coast Guard would do. You have the Cabotage Act. You have all sorts of legislation. But there is no one enforcing this legislation today. That's not the function of the Navy to enforce Cabotage Act. It is not the function of the Navy to enforce the Merchant Shipping Act and so on. That's not their function.
Okay.
So clearly, what I would suggest is yes.
Okay,
Sorry,
so
go.
let's go back to what the bill is saying. The bill is saying that
Sure.
there shall be established in the interest of aiming to protect maritime and national interest, blah, 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 subject to judicial affairs as a specialized service in the Navy. This Coast Guard will be in the Navy. And what they are saying is that, is it not just multiplicity, creating another arm within another arm? Why don't you just allow the Navy do what it's doing already? Because we have Marine Police, which was set up in 1891. We have private security guards, people like Tantita in that area, and other people playing in that space. We have the Navy, and now you're saying let's set up a Coast Guard within the Navy fold, which a lot of people are kicking against.
Yeah.
And some countries in Africa, when they have Coast Guards, are countries that don't have Navy. When they have Navy, are countries that don't have Coast Guards. And at a time we are complaining of the Oronsoye report and duplicity, is it necessary? Not forgetting we still have Marine Police there that is still being funded by the state again. Which does all of the duty of enforcement and sort of that civilian-esque duty.
Yeah, I agree entirely with you. That is why. Can I go on?
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead, sir.
Let's keep two things. Yeah, thank you. Let's keep two things separate. The first point I was making is that we need an institutional process for the Coast Guard. We don't have it in Nigeria. So I think that is a given. We need an institutional process. So I'd like to call it the Coast Guard because that is what the IMO stipulates in its mandate. The reason why Nigeria has done very badly on the IMO rankings is because we don't have vital institutions like the maritime safety, like the maritime security, and we're always out of the white list. So there is nothing wrong in having a Coast Guard in principle. The issue really that you are addressing is, would there not be a duplication, a multiplicity of functions? That is the second issue. That is an issue of, if we agree there should be a Coast Guard, what would be the structure? And I entirely agree with you that when you talk about structure, the Navy certainly will have a role, which is why I referred you to the practice in the US where the Department of Homeland Security can transfer, in times of war, the Coast Guard to the Department of Defense. In the UK, exactly the same thing happens. But the bulk of the functions of the Coast Guard is essentially civil law enforcement. And therefore, the weight of work that the Coast Guard would do will be to simply implement maritime regulations to which the Army or the Navy is not suited. That does not exclude the participation of the Navy. So what I would have expected at the public hearing is to say there's no difficulty that a maritime security agency is required. The question now is, how do we ensure exactly what you said about Orosanyan report? How do we ensure that
Dr.
the
Agbakoba.
constitution of the Coast Guard does not duplicate what we already have?
Dr.
Yes,
Agbakoba, I respect the fact that you say you don't want to respond directly to the two previous guests we had on this program. But Admiral Ezeoba was very clear. He said that the Enabling Act, the Establishment Act of the Navy, already covers police function, military function, intelligence function, and all of that. And to even say a Coast Guard will be inside Navy, the point doesn't arise. That what is to be done is to fund the existing structure properly, because it already has that Coast Guard that people are asking for. Another point that was raised by Mrs. Susoro is that this should not have come as a private member's bill, that it should be an executive function. These are basic points about law that they raised. Do you think they are right or they are wrong? Briefly.
Well, whether it comes as a private member's bill or an executive bill is not the issue. The issue is a Coast Guard an important national institution? I think it is. Should a Coast Guard service stand alone, a freestanding institution? I think it ought to stand alone. Should the Navy be part of the composition of the Coast Guard? That is open to debate. But the question is, should we have a Coast Guard service? And I think we should have a Coast Guard service. Not only is it a requirement of the United Nations Specialized Agency on Maritime, the International Maritime Organization. That is the requirement. A country must have a maritime safety agency, a maritime security agency, so the Coast Guard fulfills that function. The Navy in America is the largest in the world. Why do they have a Coast Guard? Why is the Coast Guard not part of the Navy? The United Kingdom also has a huge Navy. Why is the Coast Guard different from the Navy in the UK? So there's a reason. The Coast Guard, I would tell my dear friend Dele Ozoba, is not a fighting force. It is a law enforcement agency. It enforces maritime regulations. We have the Cabotage Act, which is not working because we don't have an institution to deal with it. So we have over 25,000 foreign vessels in our waters. If the Navy was so effective, what is it doing? So a Coast Guard is designated to deal with the protection of our maritime laws. Anyway, a Navy is a fighting force. Two different things, please.
Okay,
a
Dr.
Navy
Agbakoba.
is a fighting force and has nothing to... yes.
Well, we really have to go now. Now, this issue was discussed even at the National Conference in, I think, 2014. It was shut down. The Navy opposed it.
Yes.
We've been on this matter since 1970.
Yes.
And that was why I told Admiral Ezeoba that looks like we're dealing with territoriality here. So let's hope that we'll see how this will end with the Navy saying we don't want our powers to be reduced. Thank you very much for joining us.